My name is Ramiro Funes. I'm originally from Honduras. I was born and raised in New York. My family's from Honduras. I moved to LA, but I actually got to know Caleb a few years ago in New York. We did a lot of work together, organizing and doing protests, and also doing media work. Caleb is a really good friend of mine, and I'm so glad to have helped bring him out here to do this very important talk. And I wanted to bring Caleb out here because I think the solutions that he's talking about building and constructing, is what the socialist movement needs to hear. Because a lot of times, everything is focused on destruction, destroying, destabilizing. And as socialists and communists, we have to have a vision of what we want to create, right? We have to have a vision of what we want to build. Socialists should be seen as builders and constructors, and not just people tearing things down as edgy teenagers. And if you go anywhere in the global south and you see revolutionary movements, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about building. They're not just talking about destroying. So I wanted to, bring Caleb out here. His talks are really great. I'm sure you all follow him on YouTube. For those of you watching this on YouTube, thank you for watching this and supporting Caleb's work. Caleb has taught me a lot about politics, and I'm sure he's taught all of y'all a lot. Without further ado, I just want to introduce Caleb, political journalist, commentator. He has produced for RT, Press TV. He's written for tons of websites all around the world. So thank you, Caleb, for coming out.
All right. So it's great to be out here in California. I was a little bit worried when I flew in that maybe Kamala Harris might have a few people to meet me at the airport. But then again, I knew Ramiro was picking me up, and he'd have my back, and he could handle them. And I also knew that Ramiro has a friend named Ophelia, and she would have Ramiro's back. So I was in really good hands, so I was safe, so I had nothing to worry about there. But, it's quite interesting. We're out here, we're in California, we're talking about politics, and, I've known Ramiro for a while. I knew Ramiro back when he was in New York City as a college student. And I think it's from Ramiro that I first heard a phrase that is very important. And Ramiro quoted to me the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said, "You never step into the same river twice." You never step into the same river twice. Meaning, of course, that the world is constantly in a state of motion. Things are constantly changing. Nothing is the same. Just as much as today, being a Saturday, is most likely going to be followed by a Sunday, it'll be unlike any Sunday that has ever taken place in the entire history of the world. And that Sunday will be followed by a Monday. But that Monday, that next Monday, will be unlike any Monday that has ever taken place in the history of the world. The world is constantly in a state of motion. Things are changing constantly. I often use the phrase that I like to articulate this with. I'm sure if you've watched on YouTube, you know the phrase that I'm about to say, but I used to talk about, put the mic down for just a second. That A does not equal A. Right? There's no way this first A can be the same as this second A, because the world is constantly in a state of motion, and nothing in the universe repeats, right? Dialectical materialism tells us that the world is constantly in motion. All that exists in the world is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of change and motion. That is dialectical materialism. And when you apply the understanding that comes from dialectical materialism, you can understand how the world works. You can make predictions about how things might change. You can understand the nature of contradiction, that every thesis produces an antithesis, that every antithesis then clashes with the thesis to produce a synthesis, and then that synthesis becomes a new thesis that clashes with yet another antithesis, resulting in yet another synthesis. The world is constantly in motion, contradictions driving forward history. I've only been out to LA one other time. I was here like 10 years ago to help build a Stop War Against Iran demonstration a long time ago. But I never really had a chance to do any tourism when I was out there. So this time when I was out here, I decided I wanted to visit a place called Griffith Observatory. And, you know, it's a beautiful place out here in LA, and it's in one of my favorite movies, and that movie is not La La Land. And it's in one of my favorite movies, an old movie, a 1955 film called Rebel Without a Cause. Has anyone here ever seen Rebel Without a Cause? Classic movie. James Dean, Natalie Wood, Sal Mineo. 1955 movie about juvenile delinquents. The 1950s, the USA has a booming economy, but they couldn't figure out why there was such a rise in juvenile crime. And it wasn't crime against, you know, low-income kids. They've had, you know, that happens a lot. You know, you have low-income kids who go rob a store or get into a fight or something like that. But these were wealthy, affluent kids in Southern California who were involved in criminal activities. What was going on with that? Why was this happening, right? And the movie, it's Hollywood's, they take kind of a psychoanalytic look at it. James Dean's character feels like his father is not strong and masculine enough. Natalie Wood's character feels jealous of her younger brother, feels like she's not getting enough affection. Sal Mineo's character is closeted gay, and his parents are living away, and he's being raised by a housekeeper, and it's they're wealthy kids from Southern California, but they're involved in criminal activities. At one point in the movie, the father of the James Dean character says, you know, we bought you everything you could ever want. We bought you a car. We have a nice house. Why are you becoming a criminal? What is this about? Why are you engaging in these kind of activities? Well, it's interesting. You know, Hollywood took a kind of psychoanalytic, you know, pop psychology look at what was going on. But I think the reason that in 1955 there was a rise in juvenile crime among wealthy people in Southern California was because of what was going on in the world. Sure, the USA at that point had the highest standard of living in the world. People had more material commodities than they'd ever had. But all those houses, all those cars, all those hula hoops, all those 45 records were all dripping in blood. It was the blood of the Korean people being bombed and killed, 4 million killed when they tried to reunify the Korean Peninsula. It was the blood of people in Africa that were facing slaughter and attack when they tried to throw off the chains of colonialism. It was the blood of people in South and Central America who were also facing ugly coups and military dictatorships imposed by the United States. It was the blood of people in the southern United States living under Jim Crow segregation. It was the blood of the Chicano people who were also facing horrendous treatment in their own land after it had been stolen from Mexico. And that ugly reality was hanging over everything going on in the U.S. society at the time. You know, it's funny, he died, but I had a racist grandfather in Missouri. I remember one time I was in the house with my racist grandfather, and he was like trying to shut the screen door, and the screen door like popped out and broke. And I remember he said, "God damn it, this house must be built on top of an Indian graveyard." And I was a kid, and I thought, what in the world does that mean? You know, and I found out this was an old racist expression, right? It was a belief that the ghosts of Native Americans would like come into houses and make things break, right? That's an old racist expression. You know, this house must be built on top of an Indian graveyard. It was a racist expression. I'd never heard it, but as a kid, but my grandfather being an older guy who said these kind of things. But if you think about it, the United States, the entire United States is built on top of an Indian graveyard. And it's not just an Indian graveyard. It's an African graveyard. It's a Vietnamese graveyard, right? It's a graveyard of people from the Middle East, a graveyard of people from Latin America, U.S. imperialism. And when we talk about being socialists and revolutionaries, what separates us from those who might be reformists is that we're not looking to just kind of adjust the way things are. We want the country to be completely reborn, right? In the Islamic tradition, I learned when I was in the Middle East that they have a concept called haram, right? And they explain that if you steal some food and you eat it, it might make you sick. Or if you take out a usurious loan to get a house, that house will fall down or catch on fire. That when things are acquired in an impure way, they become corrupted, right? They talk about fruit of a poison tree in legal terms, right? When the origin is corrupt, the result is also corrupt. And that's why, as socialists, we represent a different current in U.S. history. We represent, you know, the current of John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, William Z. Foster, Gus Hall. We represent the revolutionary traditions of struggle, which have always battled against the ugly side of America, of colonialism, racism. We represent a call for refounding the entire country based on new systems of egalitarianism, compassion, human reason, and not greed and brutality. We call for a whole new America to be built based on an entirely new foundation. And it's a long tradition of socialists. And I remember when I was first getting involved in socialist politics, I was a college student in Ohio, and somebody who was in the organization I was in, they were driving from Michigan, and they picked me up from my university in Ohio, and we drove up to Buffalo, New York. And we went to the home of a woman who was well over 80, maybe even 90 years old. We sat in her living room, and she got out the photo album, and she showed us pictures from the 1950s, from the bad old days. And she told us about her life, about how in 1948, she was living in Buffalo, and the steel mill in Buffalo, belonging to Bethlehem Steel, fired every worker who was a member of the Communist Party USA for being a communist. So she and her fellow activists, they protested outside the steel plant and said that, steel workers have the right to be in whatever political party they want. The Communist Party, the Democratic Party, this is an attack on their civil rights. And across the street from the demonstration was the FBI, and they were taking pictures of everyone who was there. And the next day, in the newspaper, it printed the name and address of every single person at the demonstration. And then she was a high school teacher at the time, and a couple days later, she got called down to the principal's office. She was there at the principal's office. There were 2 FBI men there with photographs of her at this demonstration. The principal said, "Is this true? You were at a communist rally, a communist demonstration?" She said, "Yes, that's me." And he said, "Well, you're fired. You're not going to be teaching at this school." So a couple months later, she got another job at an elementary school. Everything was going fine, students, she was doing well with everybody. And one day she got called down to the office. There were the FBI men once again, photographs of her at this rally against the steel company for firing the communist workers. She also lost her job. So then she got a job at a phone company, and she was there for a couple months. The FBI showed up. She got called into the office, the FBI men, and they said, "Is this true? You're a communist? You were at this demonstration?" And she said, "Yes, that's me in the photo." And they said, "Well, you're not going to talk about communism on the phone, are you?" And she said, "No." And they said, "Then we don't care, you're fine." So she kept a job, and that's how she lived. She worked for AT&T, for a phone company, because the phone company didn't care that she was a communist, And that's what these folks had to go through. They went through some real hardship. I've also heard older folks talk about how they used to keep all the Marxist books at the public library behind the counter. And if you wanted to check it out, you could. But you'd go to the counter and you'd say, "I'd like to get one of the Marxist books," and they would write down your name. And you'd check it out. And then a couple weeks later, the FBI would come to your house and say, "Why were you checking these books out? Are you involved in any subversive organization? This was the McCarthy era." People forget how bad it is. People think it was all about Hollywood actors. They forget that it was ordinary people that were being persecuted. And our comrades went through some real hardship during those times. How do you think our comrades were feeling the night the Rosenbergs got executed? How do you think our comrades were feeling when their kids came home from school and said, "Mom, Dad, they had us hide under our desks at school, and they said it's because the communists are going to send bombs and kill us all." And I got really confused because I thought you guys were communists. I thought you told me that Lenin and Stalin were good. I'm confused. What's going on here, right? These were hard times. But I think that our comrades probably weren't as demoralized as we would suspect. I think they probably weren't as downtrodden and upset by it as you might think. Because I think they knew pretty well that you never step into the same river twice. That A does not equal A. I kind of wish I could go back in time. You ever wish you could go back in time? I wish I could go back in time, back to that point. I could say to those FBI men, those witch hunters, Joe McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee, "Sure, have your fun. Enjoy yourself. This is your time. Have your fun. But I've got a feeling you're not going to be feeling too good when Joe McCarthy is made into a national disgrace and people realize he's full of lies, he's exposed, and he goes and drinks himself to death in a bar. I bet you're not going to be feeling too good when Martin Luther King starts leading national protests and demonstrations for civil rights, an issue that the Communist Party has been talking about for a long time. I bet you're not going to be feeling too good when students all across the country and universities are burning their draft cards and sending their blood to support the Vietnamese Liberation Front. I bet you're not going to be feeling too good when anti-war rallies are taking place all over the country. You see, what they couldn't understand, and what we understand, is that the world is constantly in a state of change. You never step into the same river twice, and A does not equal And if you want to see proof of that, there's no bigger and greater example of that than the People's Republic of China. Go back a few decades, China was one of the poorest countries in the entire world, the sick man of Asia. And one of the biggest banks on Wall Street is called HSBC Bank. What does HSBC stand for? That's Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. This was a bank that was set up for the purpose of beating down China's economy and using opium to do it, right? Opium was flooded into China. There were 2 opium wars where the British Empire sent soldiers to die to make sure that they had the right to send narcotics into China, and not just narcotics, but all kinds of cheap products to make sure no Chinese manufacturers could arise, to keep that country in deep poverty. And what they call the Great Revival of Chinese civilization, it began with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Now, Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the founder of the nationalist KMT movement in China. And that, what we call the Mao suit here in the USA, that blue suit, that was the Dr. Sun Yat-sen uniform. It was the common people's outfit. That's what he wore. And his first act was to go to a temple. The peasants in China, they would be kind of humiliated by their landlords, and they would have to make sacrifices to these ancient deities. They would have to kind of bow before these statues. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he went to a temple and he smashed these idols that they were forced to worship. And he said, don't do this. This is backwardness. This is primitive. We need to have science here. We need to be advanced. We need to have reason. And that was the beginning. Dr. Sun Yat-sen's movement in China was the 3 principles. The first was independence. The second was democracy. And the third was the people's livelihood. And what exactly did the people's livelihood mean? Well, it's understood commonly that it was some vague concept of socialism, some vague understanding that the government had an obligation to care for the people. And what people also don't know is that Dr. Sun Yat-sen was a good friend of Vladimir Lenin, and that he applied to join the Communist International. Now, he wasn't allowed to fully join the Communist International because he was not a Marxist, but he was a good friend of Lenin, and Dr. Sun Yat-sen was actually an observer of the Communist International. He was allowed to attend the gatherings of the Comintern. And when the Chinese Communist Party emerged, they had a very different orientation. Trotsky wanted the Chinese Communist Party to be hostile to Dr. Sun Yat-sen and expose them as a non-communist, non-pure movement. But Lenin and later Stalin said that the communists ought to join Dr. Sun Yat-sen's movement, and that the approach that they ought to have is to say, if you really want independence, if you really want democracy, if you really want to improve the people's livelihood, then you got to become a communist, and you got to use Marxism-Leninism to do it. And that was the approach. It wasn't a sectarian approach. It wasn't a hostile approach. It was this winning approach. And it's because of that the Chinese Communist Party grew from 30 people in the basement of a women's dormitory to millions of people during the 1920s. But as we know, Dr. Sun Yat-sen died, and Chiang Kai-shek ended up taking over the KMT movement. And Chiang Kai-shek was in league with the American big corporations and with the British bankers, and he started killing communists. So the communists were forced to flee from the cities. Very famous. They fled from the cities, and that's where you get rural people's war and Mao and the guerrilla warfare out in the countryside, where they're going to isolated rural areas and leading peasants to overthrow their landlords and redistributing land. And they eventually liberated so much territory in the countryside, they established the Chinese Soviet Republic. All these people that are like talking about being Maoists and all that, I bet they've never even heard the phrase Chinese Soviet Republic. Well, they established the Chinese Soviet Republic in 1931. But of course, the rulers of the old system weren't going to tolerate that. So Chiang Kai-shek, he had some allies in Germany. There was a man named Hans von Seeckt, who was in charge of Germany in 1934. Think about that. Well, he sent a guy named Hans von Seeckt, a military general, to be an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek and how to put down the Chinese Soviet Republic. And they surrounded it, they subjected the Chinese Soviet Republic to a state of siege, and they moved in and they eventually crushed it. And Mao and his forces were forced to retreat up into the mountains. And that's when they talk about the Long March. That was the beginning of the Long March, as they were fleeing up into the mountains to get away from the crushing of the Chinese Soviet Republic. I wish I could have been there. Wish I could go back in time to say to Chiang Kai-shek and Hans von Seeckt, as they stand there and they watch Mao retreating up into the mountains, thinking, that's it, communism's over in China, we got him. Wish I could stand there and say to him, hey there, enjoy yourself. This is your time. Live it up. Enjoy it while you can. But I've got a feeling you're not going to be too happy when Mao comes down from that mountain and he's 10 times stronger than he was when he went up. And you're not going to be too happy when Mao kidnaps Chiang Kai-shek and forces him to sign an alliance against the Japanese invaders. You're not going to be too happy when, during the fight against Japan, the Red Army becomes the heroes of the whole world. When there's a best-selling book called Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow that's selling out in Europe and in the United States, where Mao is the hero fighting the Japanese invaders. Everyone wants to be like Mao all over the world. You're not going to be too happy when they eventually set up the People's Republic of China. So have your fun while it lasts. Enjoy yourself, Chiang Kai-shek. Enjoy yourself, Hans von Sect. But I got a feeling you ain't going to be happy too much longer, because A does not equal A. And you never step into the same river twice. You know, it's funny, my favorite speech written by Mao was published in 1964, and it's a speech that Mao gave to a group of university students. It's called Talk on the Question of Philosophy. So one of the anecdotes he tells in that speech is that in the cities that were controlled by Chiang Kai-shek during the Civil War, they had a song that they played on the radio all the time. And the lyrics translated to something like, "When Mao appears burning and killing, what are you going to do?" And that they played this song on the radio constantly. And of course, they forced all the kids in school to learn it as well. All the little kids had to sing it in school. When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? And of course, you know how kids are, right? If you train them to sing a song every day, they're going to start repeating it. So everywhere, all over the cities, people were hearing it. When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? And people hated this song. It was the most annoying thing ever. It was on the radio every day. And all the kids were saying, when Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? It annoyed the crap out of everyone. And then, when the Red Army would march into a city, right? And people would come out of their houses with tears pouring down their cheeks, raising their fists up in the air. They would sarcastically sing this song, when Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears killing and burning, what are you going to do? It had the opposite effect. It's kind of a funny anecdote, I think. I think that the greatest curse that hangs over our age is pessimism. Pessimism is far more dangerous than anything, right? Ideologically, right? You can talk about people thinking capitalism is a great system, or you can talk about people, you know, having illusions about how the world works. But when people are pessimistic, when they don't believe that tomorrow is going to be better than the previous day, when they don't think that waking up in the morning is going to give them something hopeful to look forward to, that is the most dangerous feeling. And I think pessimism is hanging over the United States of America right now like you wouldn't believe. People are so afraid. You know, you look at the suicide rate in the United States right now. You look at the opioid addiction rate in the United States. This is pessimism hanging over U.S. society. And, you know, I've talked a lot about ancient Rome. I've talked about, you know, the Roman Empire. I've talked about how the Roman Empire was based on the economic system of slavery. Slavery is a system where people own other people. And it's a pretty inefficient system, right? And the reason for it is simple. What motivation does a slave have to do any work? Not much. The master says, work harder or I will beat you, or work harder or I'll deprive you of food. But other than avoiding punishment, the slave really has no incentive to do anything. And the more slaves you get, the harder it is to keep making them work, right? Pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the other slave what to do. Then pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the slave what to do. It's a very, very inefficient way of doing things. And the Roman Empire, the bigger it got with its slave economic system, it became more and more inefficient. Their ability to grow crops vastly decreased. Their ability to produce goods and metal vastly decreased. Their ability to extract minerals from the ground, it vastly went down. The bigger the Roman Empire got, the more and more inefficient it became, because this system of slavery was outmoded. And there were a lot of countries that were popping up that had a more efficient system called feudalism. In feudalism, every peasant gets their little piece of land, and then they pay their obligation to the landlord, but then they get to keep what's left over. Far more efficient. They want to produce as much as they can so they can keep as much as they can. But the Romans, of course, were keeping their slave system, and the only way they could maintain it was going around to other peoples and other nations, plundering them and stealing what they had, and keeping it for themselves. And so they were a reactionary empire. They were holding back historical progress. They were keeping intact an economic order that was no longer progressive. They were holding back history. It was a pessimistic empire. And among the Romans, there were two trends of thinking. Most Romans were what you could call hedonists. And now a hedonist is somebody who, lives for pleasure. Most Romans, they would go to gladiatorial shows and bet, on the fighters. Most Romans would, they took pleasure in watching people being eaten by lions in the Colosseum. It was really common. They would have parties and stuff their faces full of food, and then they would have slaves with really long feathers to stuff them down their throats so they could vomit it all up and then go eat some more. This is at a time when most people around the world, were malnourished. So do you think people acting that way? That was most Romans. Most Romans were hedonists. But you got another trend of Romans they called the Stoicists. And the Stoicists did the opposite. The Stoicists, for example, they tended to starve themselves because they wanted to have less, and they wanted to have a spiritual experience by starving themselves. The Stoicists would take hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms and try to space out. The Stoicists, they were famous for paying lots of money to see lectures by these philosophers who telling them that they should live less and have less. The Stoicists, they were known to whip and flog themselves. They were known to worship different gods from around the empire. And these were the two trends. You could be a hedonist, but if you were just smart enough to not just be purely living for pleasure, you could be a Stoicist. You could be a sadist or you could be a masochist. But it was all about destruction. And I've talked a lot about Michael Parenti's beautiful book about Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar represented a completely different trend, the city-building tendency. Julius Caesar believed that the Roman Empire needed to completely adjust its relationship with history. He wanted to grant freedom to all kinds of different people that were enslaved. He wanted to give citizenship to people throughout the empire. I was reflecting on Julius Caesar and how he wanted to turn the various cities throughout the empire, like Alexandria and different capitals, in Gaul and elsewhere. He wanted to turn them into prosperous centers of trade. And I thought, it's funny. Julius Caesar was pretty much advocating a 73 BC version of the One Belt, One Road initiative. He was trying to transform the way the Roman Empire operated. He wanted the Roman Empire to be a force of progress around the world. He wanted to be lifting up people, empowering whole countries and nations, letting them be part, letting them have citizenship. He also wanted to empower the citizens within Rome. He was a champion of the proletarians. The proletarians, right? Who are the proletarians? Those are people that weren't slaves. They weren't owned by anybody else, but they didn't have any property. They had to rent where they lived. They were craftsmen. They sold their labor power. And Julius Caesar was loved by the proletarians. And Julius Caesar, of course, we know what happened. We learned about it from William Shakespeare. He was stabbed to death. And those greedy Roman senators who owned huge tracts of land, on some level, they probably knew that their empire needed to start changing the way it operated. But they were too greedy in the short term. They wanted so much in that moment. And they saw Julius Caesar, who was imposing taxes on them, who was talking about redistributing land. They saw him as a threat. So they stabbed to death the only person who could have saved their empire because they were in love with their own profits. There's the play by William Shakespeare. Michael Parenti in his book is very critical of that play. But it's interesting because if you read the play by William Shakespeare, Shakespeare, it seems in the play, is kind of dealing with the human relationship with power and authority. At the beginning of the play, Mark Antony, Brutus, they all get together and they kill Julius Caesar. But then they spend the rest of the play trying to figure out if they did the right thing. They spend the play trying to figure out if it was worth it or not to kill Julius Caesar. And they're debating it among themselves. They have the line about, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, who are underlings. And how on some level, Julius Caesar, despite the fact that they perceived him as a tyrant, was probably a good man. That's underlying it. And Shakespeare, of course, never went to Italy. He never lived in ancient Rome. He was writing about the human relationship with power and authority. And it's kind of the question of state power, right? We know we need a government on some level, but we all hate the government, right? A child knows they need their parents, but on some level hates their parents. This is a natural part of the human condition that Shakespeare was writing about. I also thought it's worth mentioning, that the book, The City of God, one of the key texts of the Christian religion, is written from a very defensive standpoint because the early Christian church was a little bit embarrassed about the fact that almost simultaneously, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it collapsed. And that was a little bit of a hard selling point. If you're going around the world trying to convince people to adopt your religion, and some big, huge empire adopted your religion and then collapsed, it's not a really good selling point. But it's interesting, if you read The City of God, which is still a very important text, in the development of Christian theology, if you look at it, you kind of don't even, the book's not even necessary, right? Because if you look at the teachings of Jesus, Jesus was not advising people on how to go out and build mighty empires that conquer and destroy people. Jesus said the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So the fact that the Roman Empire would collapse, an empire based on slavery and exploitation and killing would collapse when they adopted the teachings of Jesus, makes kind of perfect sense. There's no reason to be defensive about it at all, I think. It's pretty amusing. Everyone in the United States thinks they're an expert on communism. You know what I'm saying? Isn't it really annoying? Everyone in the United States thinks they're an expert on communism. I'll never forget a conversation I had one time. I was in Cleveland. I was selling a newspaper. Somebody walked up to me and he said, I have read every word that Karl Marx has ever written. I have read every word that Karl Marx has ever written, and I know that it doesn't work. I have studied it more than you have. You think you know it, but I read every word that Karl Marx ever wrote. I was kind of, wow. That's a lot of reading you did, And I said, well, I know you think Marx was wrong about socialism, but do you think he was wrong about dialectical materialism? And the guy looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, you read every word of Karl Marx? You never heard of dialectical? He's like, you're using fancy words trying to look like you know more than I do, but it's people don't know anything, right? People always say, socialism does not work. Well, somebody should have asked Yuri Gagarin, the first man in outer space, how he managed to get into space with something that didn't work. How did the shuttle that didn't work get him into space? Somebody should have asked the people living in Germany toward the end of the Second World War how an army that didn't work managed to drive in, defeat the Nazis, and unfurl the hammer sickle flag. If it didn't work, right? People should ask, why half the steel in the world today is made in these state-controlled industries of China. If socialism doesn't work, all this steel, how are they doing it? It just doesn't work, right? How is Huawei, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, making some of the best phones, better than Apple? Apple's desperate to get them pushed off the market. How is this working? It doesn't work, right? We learned in school it doesn't work. Well, there's all this evidence of socialism working pretty well, but somehow it just doesn't work, right? Everyone's an expert. Everyone's an expert. And it's amusing, you talk about Cuba, and the fact that Cuba is a very small island, and yet it's known all over the world for its achievements in terms of healthcare and medical volunteers and literacy volunteers that they send all over the world. You can compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic or Haiti or any of the countries in that area, and it's amazing what they have accomplished. The reputation that Cuba has is based on real solid achievements in that area. We talk about the situation on the border, right, where there are immigrants pouring into this country, refugees. Where are they fleeing from? They're fleeing from Honduras, a free market country. They're fleeing from Guatemala, a free market country. You don't hear about many people fleeing from Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government has made huge achievements in reducing poverty and providing health care to people. And there's so much evidence of socialism being quite successful in raising people out of poverty. There's so many examples of capitalism completely collapsing and destroying people's lives, but yet people stick to this narrative that they have. Socialism doesn't work. It just doesn't work, right? Everyone knows it. You almost want to say, whenever someone says everyone knows in front of something, you can almost guess that they're lying, right? Everyone knows. If everyone knows. Well, if everyone knows it in this society, it's a good hint that it's probably wrong. This isn't exactly a true story, but it's a story that I know very, very similar things have definitely happened. So I'm gonna give you this before I close. So you can imagine a young man, right? He lives in the heartland of the United States. He's graduated from college. He's got a load of student debt. He's working full-time job, but it's not enough that he can live on his own. He's still living with the parents. Parents aren't too happy about that. And they've noticed that their son, who usually was just all over the computer and all that, he starts reading. He's always reading books. And the last year, he's gotten really, really literary. He's reading a lot. He's not talking as much, but he's reading a lot. They're a little bit worried about their son. So they say, you know what, on Saturday night, we're going to take him out to dinner. We're going to take John out to dinner, find out how he's doing. Maybe he can talk to him about possibly getting a better job, getting into a better life situation. We're going to take John out to dinner on Saturday night. So Saturday evening rolls around. They get a reservation at a decent restaurant. Mother walks up to John's room, knocks up on the door. John, we're going to head to the restaurant. John says, Mom, I'm reading a really good book. If you could just give me a few more minutes, I just want to finish reading this book. She says, okay. Goes away. Comes back. to the door of the room. All right, John, you ready to get going? He says, Mom, I am at the most exciting part of this book. The hero is just in so much trouble, and I just got to see how this book ends. I can't. She says, okay. She's a little bit frustrated, goes away, comes back. All right, John, you finished with your book. We got to get going. We got a reservation. They're got an evening plan. It's like, I'm almost done. Just one more page. It's a short book. I'm almost done. She said, okay. Comes back. John, hurry up. Like, we gotta get going. What's going on here? All right, I'm almost done. A couple of minutes later, he comes flying out of the bedroom. He's all dressed. He's ready to go. He's like, all right, let's go to dinner. So they go to dinner. They get to the restaurant. They're in the restaurant, and they're sitting there across from each other. Father's sitting there. The mother's sitting there. John's sitting there. The father just making conversation. He says, so John, what was this book that you were reading that was like so exciting, that you just couldn't get away from it? Was it science fiction? I know you really like science fiction, don't you? He says, no, it wasn't really science fiction, but it kind of reminded me of science fiction. A little more science fact than science fiction. I said, okay, John. I said, what were you reading? And he says, brought it with me, the Communist Manifesto. Of course, this is a Trump-supporting, rather conservative family, so their jaws kind of dropped there in the restaurant, and they're looking over their shoulder. People see them, oh my goodness. And they said, John, you're reading the Communist Manifesto. I mean, what in the world? I mean, we figured you were reading like an action novel or something. What is this? He said, well, this is the most exciting story I've ever read. He says, really? He says, yeah. He says, the part where it says, a class of laborers who live so long as they find work and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and all the fluctuations of the market. He's like, that reminded me of my job at the Amazon warehouse and how my boss is trying to drive me to work harder and ripping me off. And then when I read the part about how the modern laborer, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than the population and the wealth. That made me think about how they're always trying to replace workers with machines. We're pretty close to having self-driving cars. Imagine how many people are going to lose their jobs when we have self-driving cars. These capitalists, they're really good at inventing new technology to make better profits, but it only leads to people getting poorer and poorer. And we talked about pauperism. I thought about how the roads in our neighborhood are crumbling. I thought how the standard of living is going down. I thought about all the student debt me and people my age have hanging over their heads. And then I read the part where it says, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chasing the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. I thought about how Uncle John lost his job in the factory because they sent it to another country where people were working for less, and how they've got us all competing all over the world. Who will work for the lowest wages? Who will accept the worst conditions? I read about how it compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates the world after its own image. And when I read that part, I thought about how people are pouring into this country from Honduras. People are pouring into this country from Guatemala. People are pouring in from Haiti. Why? Because the same thing that they're doing to us now, impoverishing and deindustrializing our country, they've been doing to people all over the world for years, driving people into poverty to create one giant global economy. And that's why I couldn't put the book down. This is a book about us. This is a book about our community. I couldn't put it down. I had to get to the part where it said the first step in the revolution by the working class, the proletariat, is to raise itself to the position of the ruling class and win the battle for democracy. And that meant that we're going to have a government someday that fights for us and not for the billionaires. We're going to have people in Washington, D.C. who fight against the billionaire bankers and fight for working people like us. And I read the part where it said the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, of the organized proletariat as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces in society as rapidly as possible. I thought about what that could mean. finding all the young men like me that are stuck in low-wage jobs, stuck in, living like a teenager into your adulthood, humiliated by student debt, degraded all the time. Talked about what it meant to mobilize us and get us working, get us making new breakthroughs in science, get us building high-speed railways. In China, they got these trains that are amazingly fast. They can go from Los Angeles to New York City in a couple hours. We could have that here if it weren't for the capitalists, right? I read about how we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. I will have a government that will not see us simply as tools to make profits for corporations, but see every single person in the country as an asset, someone who could be unleashed to build a better country. Every person could be put to work to build a better society. And that's why I couldn't stop until I got to the last paragraph, where it said the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have a world to win. And it might be a long shot. It seems like a long shot, right? People in the United States have heard nothing from the time they were little kids up until adulthood that communism is evil, communism doesn't work. But Joe McCarthy drank himself to death. And Mao came down from the mountain. And A does not equal A. And you never step into the same river twice. And this is the best book I have ever read. And maybe I'm putting it down for now, but I will never put this book down. This is the most beautiful story I've ever read, and I am going to fight and die to make it come true. That's a story. Like I said, not a true story, but things like it have happened, I am sure. I know for a fact. I want to just end with a story from when I was in college. I was in the university, and I was always distributing socialist newspapers. People thought I was a little bit of a quirky guy. Why are you always talking about socialism all the time? I remember, there was a friend of mine whose name was Mary Beth, and she went to the university that I went to, and the way she went there is her mother worked in the cafeteria, so she got free tuition because her mother worked on the campus. And I would see her around, and she was in some of my classes with me, political science and all of that. So one day, I'm sitting there in the cafeteria, and Mary Beth walks over to me. She said, Caleb, I just want to let you know, my mom and I, we've been reading those newspapers you leave around. We think you're right. We think socialism is probably the better system. We think that we need a socialist society. My jaw dropped because people never said that. She said, but, our dad disagrees with us. And I said, well, why is that? She said, well, he thinks it might be a good idea, but he's pretty sure that there won't be a leader who's strong enough to make it happen. Now think about those words. Not a leader who's smart enough, not a leader who's politically savvy enough, not a leader who is an effective enough orator, but a leader who's strong enough to make it happen, right? Strength. Strength is a very important thing. And if you look at the politics in the United States, the relationship to strength says a lot. I feel like a lot of people on the right, on some level, they perceive themselves as weak. They have a fear of being weak. And so, as a result, they kind of are attracted to people who present themselves as strong, right? They want to be strong. They like billionaires. They like big corporations. They like wealthy people. They like powerful military people. They want to be strong, and they have this fear that if they show any empathy or any compassion to someone that they perceive as weak, it's like an infectious disease. Like they're going to become weak if they do that. So they hate, they hate people that are low income. They hate immigrants. They hate anyone who's weaker than them because it's this fear that if they have any empathy or any sympathy, that they're going to become like them, right? And they're attracted to those that are powerful based on this inner feeling that deep down they feel like they're quite weak. But unfortunately, I feel like there are some forces on the left or the ultra-left or the synthetic left that have the opposite problem. They seem to be very attracted to anyone or any person or anything they perceive as weak, but they have opposition to anything that looks strong. If it looks strong, well, that's triggering, that's authoritarian, that's repressive, they're against it, and they're acting out some kind of rage. But there are millions of people in this country who are suffering right now. We know that. And they want someone to help alleviate their conditions, help get them into a better situation. And they want someone who's strong, that'll be capable of doing it. They don't want to see the whole country burst into flames and explode. They want things to get better. And that's why I've tried to popularize the slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A government of action. The time has come to stop judging politicians by what they say right? They all can give a good speech. They can all win our votes. They can look good on CNN and MSNBC and Fox. But what will they actually do? What action, what concrete action will be taken to alleviate the crisis? What will be done to help the people that are suffering? What will be done to stop the decline in wages? What will be done to stop the police state that is unfolding in this country right now? What will be done? A government of action would take concrete action to address this crisis. And that's what people are looking for right now. And that means getting rid of this opposition to any force that would show strength. That means trying to wrangle with how some kind of movement or how some kind of political figure could emerge. I talk a lot about Bonapartism and divisions within the ruling class, and that's something people should be thinking about. I'd say that every revolution in history started out as a fight within the ruling class that then expanded into a much wider crisis. Karl Marx's pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, is very important. It's a very important pamphlet. When capitalist crisis comes and the falling rate of profit increases and the billionaires and bankers are at each other's throats trying to figure out who can solve the crisis, that creates an opening for the people to move in. We saw what was achieved during the Roosevelt era. We saw what's been achieved in other times. You know, there have been moments where the working people of this country have really awakened. You can go back to the Civil War, how Lincoln organized a beautiful coalition. The slaves themselves stopped working in a strike all over the South. Harriet Tubman was freeing slaves all across South Carolina in the Combahee River in guerrilla warfare. Yeah, you had abolitionists, you had the labor unions, you know, yes, you had the industrial capitalists, you know, and they beat back Wall Street that wanted to keep making money on ensuring slave exports. And they beat back the British Empire that wanted that cheap cotton for their textile industry. They beat back the plantation owners. They carried out the Second American Revolution. The Civil War was the Second American Revolution. And Marxists were very key in making it happen. Read about the Ohio 9th Regiment, led by Marxists like August Willich, Joseph Wedemeyer, who helped defeat slavery in this country, organizing an entire communist division. You know, you tell people about August Willich. Abraham Lincoln actually had a communist general in the Union Army, right? You know, people say, well, the Republican Party is the party that opposed slavery. Well, back then it was also the party of Marxists, so yeah, I'll give you that. You know, I've ended a lot of my YouTube broadcasts by quoting one of the final statements of Mao, which is pretty eerie and particularly strikes at, you know, a lot. It speaks to me when I hear it. And so at one point in my life, I was very into memorizing phrases and sayings and expressions. So I'm going to end my presentation to you, and then we can open up for a discussion and a Q&A by just quoting this statement. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thank you.
Hey, Caleb, thanks for coming. I hop onto a lot of your live streams, and I just had a question about, first, whether or not you'll do a special Argentine election live stream in the next 2 weeks, and second, what you think of Andrés Manuel López Obrador's movement, and sort of, it's a broad coalition built up of right-wing evangelicals and Maoists, and I was just thinking what you think the prospects and possibly the dangers of a coalition like that are.
Caleb, just want to say thank you so much for coming out here. I really appreciate it. So my question really comes out to this idea that we are kind of living in the transition towards a new world. We're going to see probably going to see the end of Western hegemony in our lifetime. And this idea of the multilateral world order being achieved, and we're seeing it happen right now. How do you feel, with the United States kind of moving towards Cold War 2.0, right, trying to maintain this reaction to what's happening in the material world today? How do you feel that's going to pan out in terms of overall social and political development, but also how we're going to kind of deal with it going forward?
Caleb, what do you say to people who think that associating with the history of, communism, calling ourselves communists, socialists, and not shrugging off that history is more of a detriment than it is, and that can't seem to, for whatever reason, get past the conditioning that has so effectively been done.
The Kirchners came in and they got rid of the IMF and they oversaw all kinds of economic growth. But now we've had the government that's there now, and they've proceeded to get back in the IMF, hugely wreck the place with inflation, just create an economic disaster. And no one makes this link. It's bizarre to me, right? And, you know, all the problems in Venezuela are because of socialism, but all the problems in Argentina are, well, they're having problems. You know, they just have problems. And now they're going to elect a socialist again, and that'll create even more problems. It's like there's no acknowledgement of what was achieved by the coalition. It was a Popular Front government. It was an alliance of socialists, communists, and other forces. And you know, the Kirchners achieved quite a bit, and they were for the working class, and I'll definitely be following that. And that raises the question with Morena and AMLO, which is, you know, that I'm sure AMLO wants to do a lot of very good things. It is a very broad coalition. And like you mentioned, I think when you referred to Maoists, you're referring to the PT, correct? And yes, the PT did support Morena. And that it's interesting because all the Bolivarian revolutions, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, they all started with elections that were like a referendum on neoliberalism. If you are for neoliberalism, if you're for the IMF, if you're for the World Bank, you vote for one candidate. If you're against the IMF, you're against the World Bank, you're against the, you know, what they're doing and impoverishing and looting the country, cutting public spending, you vote for the other candidate. And it was a pretty clear polarization. And it was pretty clear at the beginning in all of these governments, a lot of the local capitalists who were just not wanting to be put out of business by American capitalists and American businesses and American corporations were supporting the Bolivarian candidate because it was a divide within the bourgeoisie. But, as Che Guevara famously said, as others have written about, the third world bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie of developing countries, is too weak to fight American imperialism on its own. It needs the working class. It needs the working class. The only way Hugo Chavez could have stayed in office after that 2002 coup was to get the working class on his side and to align with him. The only way Evo Morales could have stayed in power in Bolivia was to unleash the working class, right? And that's what happens. You have an anti-monopoly coalition. The Bolshevik Revolution was very much the result of a similar polarization in society. Were you for continuing World War I, or were you against it? The Bolsheviks were the anti-war people. They were against World War I. Everyone knew the Bolsheviks as the anti-war guys. Another interesting anecdote about the Bolsheviks I think is amusing. So what does Bolshevik mean in Russian? Majority. And we know that the reason it's that is because of the meeting that Lenin had in exile where he got all the great Russian revolutionaries together. Imagine that, all the revolutionaries getting together, right? Not trying to push out and have one little group with, you know, like Lenin had his own group, Bukharin had his own group. If you have your own idea, if you're a good speaker, you better start your own group. No, it wasn't like that at all. Lenin gets all the great revolutionaries in one room, and that, you know, and he says, I'm trying to build this party of a new type. The majority in the room went with Lenin, so they were the Bolsheviks. The minority went against him, they were the Mensheviks. And however, we know that most Russians had never heard of this meeting. To your average Russian, the Bolsheviks translated to the majoritarians, the populists, right? That's what Bolshevik meant. We're for the majority. We're the group that fights for the majority. We're the majority group. We're the majoritarians, right? That's what most people knew the Bolsheviks to be. I think that's particularly interesting. And they polarized the country. The Tsar had been brought down mainly because he was losing the war and it was an embarrassment. And then they polarized the country. Who is for continuing the war? Who is against it? And the anti-war capitalists that were tied in with German corporations and German banks were constantly under attack, facing, you know, there was Kornilov, who wanted to become the military dictator and continue the war aggressively, and desperately became dependent on the Bolsheviks and their militias and their armies to defend them from attack. And it got to the point that the Bolsheviks, the anti-war guys, took power. That's how it happened. There was a divide within the ruling class, and the Bolsheviks effectively maneuvered within it, built a mass base, built their own organizations, and did it. And that's what happened in the Bolivarian countries. That's what happened in the Chinese Revolution. And however, it doesn't always happen that way. The contradictions of society don't always necessarily lead that way. I think, for example, Erdogan, Duterte, Modi in India, these guys are legit, quote-unquote, bourgeois nationalists, right? I mean, they'll do what's in their interest. Sometimes they'll play ball with the United States, and sometimes they'll play ball with Russia and China. It just depends what they think, who's going to make them the best deal at the time. And the reason that they're able to have a strong, wealthy bourgeois coalition is mainly because of Russia and China, right? Russia and China, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. When Chavez and Morales were coming into power, at that point, the anti-imperialist countries were so weak that they almost desperately had to turn to the working class. So it's complicated. These are class dynamics, and I hope that answers your question. Now, as far as the Western hegemony and the danger of a new Cold War, you know, I have said many times that I feel like the main difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is that the Democrats want to go after Russia first, and the Republicans want to go after China first. And I think that that's what it is, right? China's a manufacturing country, so people that manufacture things, like Apple, that makes their iPhones, want to go after China because it's a manufacturing competitor. Whereas the big oil companies, like ExxonMobil, like BP, like Chevron, that fund the Council on Foreign Relations and the National Endowment for Democracy and have ties with the intelligence agencies, they want to go after Russia first. Why? Russia sells a lot of oil. It's a competitor, right? And this is just, it's in the short term. Who do we punish first with sanctions? Who do we isolate and attack first? Who do we put out of business so people have to buy our product and not buy it from them first? That seems to be the division between the bourgeoisie at this time. And, you know, it's playing itself out, but at the same time, what's weird is that the economy of China, the economy of Russia, the economy of various anti-imperialist countries is tied in with the global economy. It used to be, if you read Lenin, Imperialism and the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he talks about the bourgeoisie of a country as if they're completely united, and the imperialist state as if it kind of represents that individual country's national interest. But it's not like that anymore. That's what's very odd. For example, in the United States, you have one faction that was around Obama. These were big oil capitalists, but they seem to be much closer tied in with Europe. Whereas Trump and the Republicans, you go back to Freedom Fries and Bush, have often been very hostile to Europe and the NATO countries. And that we're at the point where there are definitely alliances and factions within the ruling class, but they don't go down, they don't break down among national borders like they once did. World War I, it was very clear. This was an inter-imperialist rivalry. American imperialism, British imperialism was on one side. The German imperialists, the Austrian imperialists were on another side. That was that. Not like that anymore. And it's a divide that we're seeing, and we're seeing it play out. And there's a level of just confusion. I was talking on the way to Ramiro. You know, it's interesting. A lot of countries have one intelligence agency, right? They've got their intelligence agency. The USA, we have the CIA, we have the FBI, we have the NSA, we got Air Force intelligence, Army intelligence, Naval intelligence, Coast Guard intelligence, you know, I mean, and a whole bunch that we've never heard of, most likely. We got the NYPD that has an office in almost every state. It's got an office in Tel Aviv. We've got all kinds of people competing for the prize of being the intel agency, competing for the same tax revenue. Right? And we also know, because of neoliberalism, they don't do their work themselves. They contract it to somebody. So we got all kinds of people competing for the same money with different agendas, different targets, different people they're going after. This is confusion. You know, people talk about the deep state. If you listen to the Trumpers talk about the deep state, they make it sound like they're all on the same page. It's this big deep state conspiracy. Well, actually, when you talk about deep state, you're talking about like chickens running around with their heads cut off. You're talking about a country that's being pulled in 10 different directions with 10 different agendas. I feel like Tulsi Gabbard, the way she talks, she's not a socialist, she's not a communist. She speaks for a lot of people in the Pentagon. A lot of people in the Pentagon, whose job it is to fight terrorists and fight al-Qaeda, have read a history book and are like, okay, so why are we fighting Assad when he's a guy who's, you know, gone after al-Qaeda? Why did we overthrow Gaddafi when he's a guy who's fought with al-Qaeda? Why are we friendly with the Saudis where that ideology, that Wahhabi ideology comes from? There's a lot of people in the Pentagon who probably agree with every word Tulsi Gabbard says and said this war on terror is helping the terrorists. It's not hurting the terrorists. What's going on here? But you can see the Democratic Party's mainstream really wants to shut her up. However, you'll notice that Fox News is pretty friendly to Tulsi because there are people in the Trump camp who feel that way. But you'll also notice there are a lot of people in the Trump camp who don't feel that way. There's a lot of confusion as a result of the fact that the rate of profit is falling, that we're having an economic crisis that was created by technology, that they don't need workers and the means of production anymore. Marx describes workers as appendages to machines, but we now have machines with no appendages. And of course, workers are consumers, and if they can't get paid, they can't get hired, they can't buy back the products they produce, the market's glutted with products that cannot be sold. We've got self-driving cars hanging over our head. This is the crisis of capitalism, and they fight amongst themselves in order to resolve it. Now, to your question. The reason that I think it is important to invoke the history, well, first, let me back up. I'm not completely loyal to the term communists, right? Why did the Bolsheviks call themselves communists? It was because the Second International were calling themselves socialists and social democrats, and they supported World War I. So the Bolsheviks said we have to start calling ourselves something different, so they started calling themselves communists. And why did the Marxists eventually stop using the term communist? Well, because communist was associated with ultra-left adventurism and anarchism, so when they were building new parties, they started saying we're socialists or social democrats. And then the Bolsheviks, when they were trying to differentiate themselves from the parties of the Second International, started calling themselves communists. This is semantics. I'm not loyal to any particular word. We could call it whatever we want. We could call it lampshade. We could call it, purple, green, whatever. I'm not loyal to any particular word. But the reason it is important to invoke this legacy is because every argument I have ever had with anyone about socialism immediately begins with, everyone knows what happened in the Soviet Union is millions and gajillion people died and socialism completely fails. And in fact, arguments about health care begin that way. Bernie Sanders says, I want to give every American health care. They deserve it. And they say, you can't do that. Look at communism. They all just failed and everyone died the whole time. It comes up in every conversation. The entire political debate in the United States is premised on a big fat lie, which is that socialism has never had any success anywhere in the world. And if we can't counter that lie, there is really, neoliberalism wins. And that's why I get very frustrated when leftists get up and say, well, that's not real socialism. That's not real it's like they think they're gaining credibility somehow. They think, well, if I just denounce all the socialism that's ever existed, and I'm not opposed to criticizing, I'm not opposed to admitting that things weren't as they should have been or the mistakes were made, but when they get up and say, don't associate me with that, then we're back to square one where socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And I will say, that if what PragerU and if what Ben Shapiro and people like that said was true, if everywhere socialism had ever been implemented, all it did was make life worse, if never had it created economic growth, if never had it raised people out of poverty, if never had it created technological innovations, if Shostakovich had never composed his music, if Sergei Eisenstein hadn't invented the montage, if the Soviet engineers hadn't invented the mobile phone, if LED lights hadn't been created, if Sputnik had never been launched, then they would be right. And they would be absolutely right. But the fact is, the historical record shows something else. But I have also emphasized, and taken a great deal of flack for it from certain people, that we should make clear that just like Chinese socialism was very, very different from Soviet socialism, just like Cuban socialism is very, very different than Soviet and Chinese socialism, just like Venezuela's Bolivarian socialism is very, very different from the Bolivarian socialism of Bolivia, that socialism, when it comes to the United States, will be a uniquely American socialism. It'll be a socialism rooted in the contradictions and the struggles right here on this soil. We are not going to copy the Soviet model. We are not going to copy any other country. And the only type of socialism that the American people will ever accept will be a socialism specifically invented by them to address their own concerns. Right? So if you're LARPing for the day that the U.S. government declares itself to be a Maoist third worldist and we change the American flag to a hammer and hoe or something like that, then you're going to be disappointed. That's not what it's about. But that doesn't mean we should surrender the 20th century. Right? We can be critical of what went on, and we definitely, in terms of the wars that are going on, whether it's against Syria, the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government of Syria, whether it's the attacks on Venezuela, we need to point out that these governments have done really good things for their population and have raised people out of poverty, and we shouldn't let them just portray these governments as just tyrannical, horrendous institutions that everyone wants to violently overthrow. And especially when they're trying to tweak up the population for yet another war or invasion, that anti-communist or pro-imperialist propaganda is very key in what they're doing, and it needs to be countered. So that's my answer to the three questions. Let's have some more questions. This is fun.
Round two. All right. So another thing that really strikes my concern is that with the rise of China and Russia and in really kind of the rebuilding of the developing world into something that is beyond what we have known for the last 500 years is something that is really going to change the dynamics of our society and economic development. But we see, the efforts in Hong Kong and places in Venezuela where the CIA and institutions undermine the aspects of new and democratic movements throughout the world. Obviously, we're going to see a lot more of that. But in your opinion, do you think that these movements that the U.S. government engages with to support the undermining of the developing world, do you feel that they are actually harming the U.S. foreign policy apparatus more than they are helping? So you have these movements that are being supported by the U.S. government, but it's seen as a rallying cry for a lot of people in those countries to kind of engage with the revolution and engage with these movements that are trying to maintain their sovereignty. Do you think that this is really that these movements the U.S. government is supporting is really actually harming the U.S. credibility overseas in terms of its foreign policy and not really acting in the agenda that they think that it's supporting?
Lula da Silva was just interviewed, and he, I think it was by the BBC or another, or maybe it was a left journalist, but basically he said one of the biggest regrets he had was not was sort of pushing off Brazil trying to acquire a nuclear weapon because he said that's the only way they respect you. And then he said, when I get out of here, I'm going to get the haircut and the suit, and I'm going to emulating Kim Jong-un. And then so he said, well, he said basically that was the only thing that gets the imperialists to respect you. And we saw with Brazil a true open sort of cosmopolitan social democracy that was eventually crushed because you didn't have any parameters to fight against, whether it was media oligarchs or anything like that. So I was just wondering if there comes a day for something like that in America, what sort of steps would we have to take to prevent the same thing that's happening to Lula da Silva in Brazil and the destruction of the Workers' Party?
So in regards to the question about these movements the USA is supporting around the world, and do they hurt the interests of the United States? I think it's really important to talk about the Cold War because there's a lot of confusion about the Cold War. Fox News repeats over and over and over again, and the right-wingers repeat over and over and over again, that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. He just built so many nukes, and he escalated the arms race, and the Soviets ran out of money, they went bankrupt, and then that was the end of the Cold War. And that's historical fiction. In fact, Reagan's escalation of the arms race kind of had the opposite effect. It made the Soviet government a little bit stronger. It had created a rally around the flag effect. It reinforced that American and Western capitalism was attacking. The Cold War was won by the liberals. Let's be real about that. It was the Eastern establishment, it was the intel agencies that they won the Cold War for the United States. They created a constituency among the Soviet population who were convinced that if only the Soviet government were overthrown, they would keep their guaranteed job, keep their guaranteed health care, but also be able to wear balloon jeans and shop at Walmart and have lots of fancy Western goods. And, you can read, you talk about Brzezinski, Polish-American, I believe, who was he was key in setting up, revolts across Eastern Europe. He eventually, set up in Afghanistan, made Osama bin Laden, crafted him for the media to look like Che Guevara, right? He stole left aesthetics for the war in Afghanistan and created this PR image of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden as if they were, heroic, guerrilla fighters in the woods, and the Soviet Union was just this evil, rolling tank coming, and that was stealing left aesthetics. That wasn't a right-wing appeal. That was a co-opting of left-wing sentiments. And the Prague Spring, you should read, there's a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson, and it's this new left counterculture wank, basically, that goes on for pages, but it goes on about how there's this new movement that's arising in the world. It's neither pro-communist nor anti-communist. It's about love and peace, and people in the Eastern Bloc and people in the United States are all going to join hands and bring down the evil tyrannical regimes, and it's so amazing. You read this book and you look at the endorsements on this book. It's endorsed by all the CIA people. That was what they were doing. By creating a constituency among Soviet government officials and within the Soviet bureaucracy that was convinced the USA wasn't so bad, didn't want to hurt them, was their friend, and basically, manipulating and using some of the weaknesses of the Soviet system, the fact that, in the Soviet Union, anyone who, if you were a dissident, if you were against the Soviet bureaucracy, you got disappeared in the middle of the night. Well, first of all, that creates resentment. People don't generally like, living in fear like that, number one. And number two, then their arguments never get refuted. And it's almost assumed that they're right, because why do they have to drag them away in the middle of the night if they, and that creates an atmosphere where, when the population is not being encouraged to engage with ideas, right? In Cuba, there are a lot of dissidents that are against the government. What the Cuban government does is it mobilizes people to go and argue with them and refute their arguments and expose them, right? Very different approach, right? Bringing people into politics tends to be very effective, but we know the late Soviet bureaucracy didn't really do that. And Brzezinski and George Soros, yes, I said his name, George Soros, and these folks, they knew how to manipulate, all of that. And these kind of covert efforts, building NGOs, funding artists and art galleries, making the United States look like it was the happy, happy free land of Beatles music and Jackson Pollock's paintings and pornography, and that was very effective. And social liberalism, unleashing social liberalism in the West, was very effective, right? And the Cultural Revolution that the West underwent in the 1960s was very key in winning the Cold War. If that hadn't happened, if the West hadn't loosened up, if we, we didn't have naked people on TV and stuff over here, we never would have beat the Soviet Union. It's funny, I used to hear people say things like Beatles music destroyed the Soviet Union. I used to roll my eyes like, it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And that's actually true. I mean, there's a lot of truth in this, right? And that what's going on in Hong Kong right now, what they've tried to pull in Nicaragua, this is the old Cold War tactic. This is Brzezinski tactics. This is George Soros. This is what they're doing, right? And the military-industrial complex tends to have a very different strategy. They don't care if the rest of the world likes us. They want to blow shit up. In fact, they don't want proxies to do it. They want the government to spend lots of money, sending in the tanks and the bombs and the planes to blow things up. And I think there's strategy debates going on in Washington right now, too. I think that the Trump faction is very much a military faction that feels like unleashing these color revolutions might not be as effective, and instead we need to use the mother of all bombs, the MOAB or whatever in Afghanistan. We need to force countries around the world to buy more weapons from us and sell lots of weapons for the military-industrial complex. And the establishment, the intelligence establishment that has had quite a bit of hegemony. I mean, you look in the 90s, they controlled both parties. I mean, it was both parties were in with the CIA. George Bush, the Bush family, what's that? That's CIA, they were in with the Democrats and the Republicans, and they seem to have lost control of the Republican Party at this point. And there's a faction in the Democratic Party that would like to push them out too. They don't like Bernie. They don't care for Bernie Sanders. They know he was in Nicaragua. They know he's been to Cuba. I mean, they don't trust Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders can say whatever he wants about Hugo Chavez and call Hugo Chavez every dirty name in the book, but they still know who Bernie Sanders is. They know that he came to office as a result of a mass movement, and regardless of whether Bernie is purely still thinking that way or not, they see him as dangerous, right? And the Bernie Sanders wing they see as dangerous. They see Trump as dangerous because he's not tied in with their forces. And this is a big divide that's going on, and it's happening. And the other dirty secret is, it's funny, right? Keynesianism. We all know about Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes, The Wealth of Nations, right? The way to save a capitalist economy when there's a downturn is to spend money. John Maynard Keynes says what we do is we send somebody out and he digs a hole, and we pay him to do it, and then we send somebody else out, and we pay them to fill the hole back in, and this isn't a waste of money because they both take their money home and they spend it, and that's how we stimulate the economy. That's Keynesian economics. That's different than Schachtian economics, and I think we need to differentiate the two. Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi economist, Hitler's banker, he didn't say, let's pay people to go dig holes and fill them in. He said, why don't we take a huge chunk of the population and put them in concentration camps? Right? And they're not out looking for jobs. And we got a whole bunch of jobs for these other people, being guards in those concentration camps, building those concentration camps. Hjalmar Schacht didn't just say, let's spend money on building art galleries or bridges. He said, let's pull out of the Versailles Treaty and have a military-industrial complex. The prison-industrial complex, which was immediately implemented, that was the result. Coming out at the beginning of the Cold War, we developed immediately a military-industrial complex. And then 70s and 80s, we started building a prison-industrial complex. This is Schachtian economics. And what makes it different than Keynesian economics is Keynes just wants to spend money. But Schacht says we also have to deeply impoverish a big section of our population. We have to take, in order to stimulate the economy, take big chunks of our population and reduce their standard of living while building up one section of our population that sees an increase in its standard of living and will then be utilized to control that other section. That's Schachtian economics. That's the difference between Nazi economics and just government spending Keynesianism. And we very much have a Schachtian economic model in the United States. And that's what the Nazis used in order to solidify their regime. And I think that's unfolding greatly because they've been doing it. We already have a prison-industrial complex. We already have a military-industrial complex. So what are they going to have to do to escalate it to avert the crisis, right? And it's also very clear that right after Obama was elected, some of the richest of the rich in the United States, like Warren Buffett and others, said it's Roosevelt time, right? Warren Buffett said, tax me more. That movie, Capitalism, A Love Story, came out. There was a movie attacking capitalism in all the theaters that ended with, I can't do this alone, why don't you go out in the streets? And I was there. I was a very active leftist activist at that point. And I saw it with my own eyes. There were sections of the ruling class that were saying, all right, communist socialism, go get them, Tiger. You guys are so weak, you're not going to take power. We're not threatened by you. Just go out and do your thing. Go out and do your thing so we can use it to crush the Koch brothers and others. Get to it, And the left fell on its face, and it was a disaster. Occupy Wall Street was not a left operation. It was the result of the fact that they had told the left, go do your thing, and it didn't work, right? And that was a disaster, and that's how weak the ML groups are. And that's the situation that the organized political left is in the United States. And that's a result of what I've talked about many times, the fact that, in the 1970s, these people tried to do what you're supposed to do and go and organize people in communities, and there was a booming U.S. economy, and people didn't want to hear it, so there was this internalized belief that average Americans will never be interested in this stuff, so we just have to retreat. Anyway, enough about that. We're on to Brazil. I was in Brazil in 2016. I actually spoke to 5,000 to 6,000 oil workers in Brazil at the trade union center at their gathering. And I was there, and it's funny, there's a picture of me shaking hands with Michel Temer. As embarrassing as that is, right? Like, me and Michel Temer are shaking hands. I think it's hilarious. But I was in Brazil, and I met with, trade union activists there, and there was kind of a feeling that if they could have been further unleashed, right? If there was a fear on the part of a lot of the social democratic leaders that if we let the communists and socialists get out of hand, there was a feeling that on some level, Lula and Dilma had been holding back progressive forces. They were aligned with them, but they were not willing to let them go out and do their thing fully. As far as nuclear weapons, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is in effect, and I think that Russia and China in particular really want to keep the Non-Proliferation Treaty in existence, because if the Non-Proliferation Treaty goes away, then the arms race escalates like you wouldn't believe. And I think that's why they've been harshly critical of North Korea for pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For Brazil to acquire a nuclear weapon, they would have to then withdraw from that treaty, which could then, if the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty were to go away, that would open some doors that could be very, very dangerous to the entire human race. So if it were up to me personally, I wouldn't advocate Brazil getting a nuclear weapon, but I can understand why someone would feel that way. And again, the North Koreans do have a point, right? All the countries that were accused of having weapons of mass destruction and didn't have them were invaded. And the one country that actually has a pretty big weapon of mass destruction has stayed in power. So the USA, when it says it's deterring people from acquiring nukes, it's kind of doing the opposite. It's kind of saying to countries, hey, if you want to not be overthrown by the USA, you better get a nuclear weapon, right? Maybe the president of the United States will go shake hands with your leader if you just get one. That's kind of the message that's being sent out. And I want to talk about William Z. Foster, because it's funny, when I was a young person in Ohio, I ordered through Interlibrary Loan a book called Towards Soviet America. That is an amazing book. Right? It's a little more tanky than, some of the paragraphs about banning the YMCA and stuff are a little bit, I don't think we would talk that way these days, but it's a great book. I mean, you read it, he lays out, one thing that I think is interesting about William Z. Foster, right? So, you have to remember William Z. Foster, he was an Irish American, born in Massachusetts, grew up in Philadelphia. He was in a street gang called the Bulldogs. And William Z. Foster, he joined the Wobblies. He was in the IWW. But he felt like the Wobblies were disconnected from average people. They wouldn't join the existing labor unions. They insisted on forming these radical, isolated communist unions. And so he formed a faction within the Wobblies that said, we need to go into the existing unions and bore from within. And so they broke away from the Wobblies and they formed the Syndicalist League of North America. And William Z. Foster was part of the Syndicalist League of North America. He eventually was able to get hired by the AFL in Chicago to organize the packing house workers of Chicago's, meat pack. That's the jungle, Upton Sinclair. We read about how awful the conditions were there. And he effectively unionized the packing houses of Chicago with all of his anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist buddies that the AFL-CIO, he managed to maneuver himself into that position. And then, after World War I ended, he went ahead and he had maneuvered to go and organize the Great Steel Strike of 1919. 365,000 steel workers on strike. Can you imagine such a thing happening in the United States? Woodrow Wilson calls William Z. Foster to the White House, and William Z. Foster says he talked to him in roughneck talk. He figured this is an ignorant worker, so I better, roughneck it up here. This here strike you're having, Mr. Foster, this is hurting our country. This is kind of hilarious, the condescension of Woodrow Wilson. But William Z. Foster organizes this huge strike. It ultimately fails. And the Communist Party USA, which had just been formed, is in its ultra-left period by people who think the Bolsheviks are amazing because they waged a violent revolution. Throughout the entire strike, they're denouncing William Z. Foster. They're calling him E.Z. Foster. They put up posters all over Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana, saying the only way to win the strike is to build a workers' militia and arm yourselves. And so William Z. Foster is not particularly fond of the Communist Party. He thinks these are a bunch of kooks. I'm trying to organize workers here. These are a bunch of kooks. So after the strike has failed, and after he's kind of demonized as this radical labor leader who's caused all this unrest, and he's like on the run from the U.S. government, he visits the Soviet Union. And he goes to the Soviet Union, and he finds out that Vladimir Lenin had been urging the American communists to support his strike. The whole time, these communists that were ultra-left, that were putting up posters and calling him E.Z. Foster and saying that unless the workers had guns, there was no point. The whole time, Lenin had been telling them to support William Z. Foster's strike, and that this theory of boring from within, going into the existing unions and winning workers to socialist politics, this theory was something Lenin had come up with in the Soviet Union already. And on that basis, William Z. Foster comes back to the United States, and he takes Jack John Stone and the Dunn brothers, Bill Dunn and others, and they join, they found at the Unity Convention, where the Communist Party USA, or the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party and the Socialist Party Pro-Bolshevik Committee and Foster, and they all get together, and in the middle of the woods in Bridgman, Indiana, they form the Communist Party USA, right, 1921, the Unity Convention. And after they form the party, then the police come in and arrest everybody, and they all are on trial for doing it. I mean, you think about what our comrades have done, it's really amazing. But, the height of William Z. Foster's leadership in the Communist Party, when he was running for president in 1932, the height of his strength was the third period they talk about, fight or starve. The Great Depression had begun, and the Communist Party was saying, don't starve, fight. And hunger marches, unemployed people that were desperately hungry, that were starving and dying. The Communist Party is organizing them to go to City Hall and raise holy hell and scream and yell until they can get, some social assistance. He's leading thousands of people in Times Square and in Union Square in New York City, and he's organizing desperately poor, starving people to demand their rights. And that was his strength. And this is a man who's really dedicated. I mean, he has a heart attack, right, in the middle of it. I mean, he has a heart attack, and he's forced to go to the Soviet Union to get medical care. I mean, William Z. Foster was really, he was somebody in the United States who his life and his thinking and his political development very much parallels Vladimir Lenin. And Mao Zedong particularly liked William Z. Foster, which is particularly interesting. Why would a communist in China be paying so much attention to a leader of a tiny party in the United States? But when William Z. Foster defeated Earl Browder and refounded the Communist Party, Mao sends him a personal telegram thanking him for his work. William Z. Foster on his deathbed, when he was in the Soviet Union getting, medical care, he's in his 80s. For his birthday, Khrushchev comes to visit him at the hospital. And William Z. Foster is such a lover of Mao that in his hospital bed, this 80-year-old man starts shouting at Khrushchev, "How dare you cut off relations with with China? How dare you?" And then Khrushchev runs out of there. I mean, William Z. Foster was a real. There's a biography of him. They call him the working class giant. He was really a giant in a lot of ways. I've always been very, very inspired by William Z. Foster and his work, and I think people should engage with it. Now, not everything he said is necessarily correct, but one concept that William Z. Foster raised is he talked about, at the time, after the Second World War, all these countries in Eastern Europe were having socialist, revolutions, but it wasn't, on a basis of socialism. All the anti-fascist capitalists who, all the anti-fascist forces who had fought the Nazis were unifying to form governments, right? And they called them people's democratic governments. And William C. Foster came up with a formulation that when socialism, the beginning of socialism in the United States would be an anti-monopoly government, a government that opposes the big monopolies, right? It might have small business owners in it, might have some capitalists in it, that it would be an anti-monopoly government and against the monopolists and building an anti-monopoly coalition. That's William Z. Foster. And he probably got that from the populists, right? Because back before he was a communist, he was a populist. He was in the People's Party. And they didn't rant against capitalism, they ran it against monopolism. And there was a feeling among a lot of Americans who believed in capitalism that monopolism, when one big corporation has all the power, that's not the American way. And so that's kind of interesting as well.
Caleb, I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming out to LA. We appreciate it. For a long time, I've been involved in social movement for almost over a decade, so it's been quite some experience. But there's a lot going on in the 21st century. We're entering a new period in human history, a new period in our country's history, and we see a lot of people coming up with the same old solutions, the same old ideas, kind of ramping at the same old concept, like, well, this is the way it was then, this is the way we got to do it now. But a lot of the messages that I hear and things that I read from you and things that I'm hearing from people involved in this movement going forward in terms of pragmatic application we see people saying we need an American socialism, we need a movement for change, we need to be part of something. And the fact of the matter is that we live in a society that isn't perfect and things are changing, but we have to adapt to the conditions that we've been given and the hand we've been dealt. And going forward, this idea that the United States is, whatever the institutions that we have today, right, fighting to maintain society and trying to maintain that hegemony over the world, we're not going to win Cold War 2.0. That ship has sailed a long time ago. We're not going to be part of reimagining the neoliberal movement. We have to create something different. And I really appreciate the words and the messages that you've given that really inspire people to believe and hope for something different. And I just want to say thank you.
I don't have much more to say, but I've said on my YouTube lives that I feel like we're building a community. I've noticed, when I first started doing them, like one time I got 60 people on the YouTube live, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. But now, it seems like I'm going 120 every week, 150, 160. By the end of the week, it's usually at 1,000, 1,500. I mean, there's a real thirst for what we have to offer. Not just what I have to offer, but what you all want to hear, and this kind of these ideas that we're putting out there. And a lot of people say to me, the reason that people have a thirst for this is because it's so unique. Right? There's a lot of people walking around calling themselves socialists and communists in the United States right now. They don't sound anything like me. It's a little bit weird. Sometimes I look at myself in the mirror and I say, what is going on here? It's a little bit strange. And it shows that there's a real thirst for what we have here. And that, my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, the reason I wrote it was because, when I talk about the Cold War, when I talk about Marxism and socialism, I realize that a lot has been lost. A lot of what socialists and Marxists are all about has been kind of buried in this avalanche of confusion and ideological deception. I've said that technically the phrase abolish billionaires is not correct. Why? Well, because if you read the Communist Manifesto, it says the goal is to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. And that the ultimate goal is to create a society in which there's no need for a state, right? That's communism, not socialism. Communism, the ultimate vision, is a society in which there is so much material abundance, there's so little work that's necessary, technology has increased so much, and prosperity has increased that people can just do what they want, and money fades away, and people just, they talk about people being able to just do what they feel like doing and take what they want. Right? From each according to his own ability, from each according to his need. That vision of the Communist Manifesto was based on vast material abundance. It probably won't come for thousands and thousands of years. But that's been lost. When I say that, technically we don't want to abolish billionaires. We want to raise the level of wealth and prosperity in society so high that there's no need for any money in state. And then when you say abolish billionaires, that kind of feeds into the idea that we want everyone to be equally poor. And, when I say that, I've noticed the reaction I get from people is explosive. You would have thought I said, that, I don't even know what it was like. But the reason is that people are so unfamiliar with Marxism. There's a very famous Marxist I have the pleasure of interacting with, and I asked him, I said, why are people so explosive in response to this? He said, Caleb, you're expecting Americans to know something about Marxism. That's your first mistake. He was right. He was right. This ideology has been lost in a lot of ways. And so what we're doing here is we're beating a drum that needs to be beat. We're keeping alive that flame. When I talked about going to Buffalo and sitting with that woman who took out the photo album, I talk about, the interactions I had with some of these old communists in their 80s and 90s, and most of whom have died by now, were some of the most valuable interactions I ever had. These people went through McCarthyism. These people went through the peace movement in the 1960s. These people have memories of the young pioneer camps in Brooklyn where kids in little red berets would sing, 1, 2, 3, young pioneers are we. We're fighting for the working class against the bourgeoisie. They have memories of when the socialist and communist movement wasn't a fringe bohemian, trend. It wasn't a phase people went through in college. It was a group of people fighting to survive. And as capitalism melts down, people are going to be more hungry, and they're going to be suffering. It's funny, I don't think Andrew Yang's solution, universal basic income, is the answer. But I think he's a valuable candidate because he's the only one saying what Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, which is that Workers are eliminated by machines, and that leads to great poverty. And he's not saying what the actual solution is, which is that the banks, factories, and industries, these machines that we ourselves have built, need to be controlled by ourselves, by us. They don't need to be operated according to profits of a capitalist. They need to be operated in the interest of all of society. That's Marxism. That's capital. I just summarized 1,000 pages of capital, right? The capitalist is constantly looking to make production and technology more and more efficient, and as a result, millions of people are outcast and starving amid the wonders they have made. And the only solution is for these machines and for these factories and for these centers of economic power to be controlled by the people and operated in public interest. And it is by controlling the means of production that China has become the second largest economy in the world. You know, that's Marxism. You know, we can argue about details, we can talk about mistakes that were made, but ultimately that is the Marxist narrative of history. It's not pessimism. It's not there is no future. It's not we're all going to die from global warming, so what's the point? You know, it's not we need to go back to the age before electricity. You know, it was funny. You know, when they're attacking the government of Nicaragua, right? The majority of the people in Nicaragua are indigenous. They're an indigenous people, but they find certain sects of very, very, very religious indigenous people who don't believe in technology, and they hold them up and say, see, the government of the Sandinistas is trying to impose electricity on them. They're going to build power. This is offensive. I tell people this is kind of like, you know, like if like someone was arguing that German Americans in Pennsylvania were oppressed, and they got like, you know, they got like Ezekiel Yoder, the chief of the Amish, to get on there and say, yes, they're trying to build a power plant in Pennsylvania. They're oppressing us. The Amish, we're being oppressed. You know, that's kind of what they're doing. But this cult of opposing historical progress. Climate change is real, right? I know there are some people on the left who don't agree with that, but I'm not one of them. Climate change is an absolute reality. But the solution to climate change is using our resources in a rational way, not in the interest of profits, and it's getting beyond fossil fuels. The fossil fuel-based economy is a trap that these capitalists have set up. Look at all the big banks. HSBC Bank, who are they tied in with? BP. ExxonMobil. What is that? It's the descendant of Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, and what's their bank? Chase, right? This is the oil-based global order is destroying the planet, and it's also holding back human progress. And they have decided the solution to global warming is, well, all these other countries around the world just have to stop developing because it's bad, and we control all the oil as it is, so you can all keep depending on us, but you can't build any of your own power plants, and you can't start developing your own fuel sources because, hey, global warming, guys, so we stay at the center of the global economy. History ends. The game is over while we're ahead. End of history. That's their solution. That's not the solution. The solution, I think, has a lot more to do with fusion energy, right? You know, when China went to the moon recently, they extracted something called helium-3. If helium-3 were utilized in fusion energy, the implications could be massive. People talk about the entire Earth being powered, for generations and generations to come. That helium-3 stuff, if fusion energy could become a reality, some real energy miracles could happen. And China imports oil. They don't have very much of it to begin with, and they depend on oil imports. And so they are actively trying to explore alternative energy more than any other government, not just solar panels, not just windmills. They got plenty of those. But they're actively looking at alternatives that we in the United States conveniently have underfunded. You know, I went once back in the days when I was working with Press TV. I interviewed somebody who was with the Fusion Energy Center out in New Jersey. A scientist, he was talking about how this work we're doing is so important, but the government doesn't want to fund us. The big oil companies certainly don't want to fund us. But there's real potential here. So that's very exciting. And let's not forget that every great advance in history came with a new leap in production, right? That hunter-gatherer civilization was replaced by slavery and feudalism because they developed a new mode of production, subsistence farming. Capitalism replaced feudalism because it had a new mode of production, industry. But all the socialist countries had the same mode of production. They were industrial countries, but it was organized along socialist lines. But now artificial intelligence is pointing toward a possible new mode of production. So I think that point needs to be raised. Nelson Peary makes that point in his book, The Future is Up to Us, which I encourage people to read. But it's a fair point to raise, right? That all throughout feudalism, there were peasants who rose up and seized control of their little tract of land, but they didn't have a new mode of production, so eventually feudalism came in and crushed them, right? And the Soviet Union had the same mode of production as the capitalists, But now we have a higher mode of production unfolding. Jack Ma, I saw him speak when I was at the Valdi Discussion Club, and he basically pointed to the fact that both World War I and World War II followed great leaps in technology. I think we're on the precipice of a big change, not just in terms of geopolitics, not just in the terms of the politics of this country, but in terms of human history. This is a time to be very, very optimistic. It's a time of great danger, but it's also a time of great, great hope. And the hope that's coming out of China right now, the hope that's coming out of the Bolivarian countries, we need to counter the pessimism. We need to build a city-building tendency within the United States. We don't need to be Stoics. We don't need to be hedonists. We need city builders in the United States of America. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.